Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rationally Speaking with myself, Martin Turner, and Stuart Carrington.
Hi everyone, pleasure to be here. Good to see you, Martin. How have you been?
Good. Yeah, been looking forward to this. It's been a while, hasn't it, I think?
Yeah, I was just saying, I feel a little bit like not match fit for it, but I think we'll get back into our groove relatively quickly, seeing as this is just what we tend to chat about.
Yes, and you know, in this short break that we've had, you've aged a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
So I just want to get that in there. I just want to reflect what the audience is probably thinking.
Well, you're a man of the people, Martin.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anything?
It's often been said.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, the people's champion. Yeah.
The beard has put at least another 8 months on you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't really what I was looking for when I went for it, but yeah. But just because I want to, like not age as rapidly as I am, doesn't mean I have to. It doesn't devalue me as a person, or does it?
I see what you've done there. What you've done is you've taken that conversation and you made it REBT related.
Do you know about REBT? Have you heard of it?
No.
We'll introduce it today.
Thus, yeah.
I just wanted
thus highlighting the falseness of this podcast.
Was that a seamless segue into what we're going to discuss today?
I don't know if it's seamless.
Right, but
I could see and feel the seams. But yeah, it does link quite nicely. So I think today, I mean, we've had this conversation a lot, haven't we, over the years around misconceptions of REBT. And I think partly because maybe it's sometimes frustrating how REBT gets misconstrued. It's certainly not helpful in terms of trying to communicate REBT accurately, having to also address the misconceptions.
Mm-hmm.
But also I think it reflects the extent to which REBT in some ways has fallen out of psychology education. To the extent that actually when you get to MSc, PhD, stage 2 levels, that REBT is seen as this new thing. Was actually, it's been around for a while, and we probably should know more about it, but we just haven't really been educated in it at undergrad and often at postgrad levels.
So firstly, it's certainly overlooked, and it wasn't until I went to postgrad level that I even kind of heard about REBT, and which is kind of surprising, seeing as CBT is relatively well known, almost kind of like mainstream, and yet REBT, really like a founding approach in that family of therapy is kind of really overlooked. And I just don't know, do you have any reason why that's the case? Like, why has it been overlooked?
I always think it stems back to, and we've probably spoken about this before, on a previous conversation. I often think it's because of the different places that cognitive therapy and REBT started. So Ellis came from a philosophical viewpoint, really, and obviously REBT is highly steeped within particular philosophical traditions. Obviously, one of those philosophical traditions is the scientific tradition, But it's not that Ellis was a practicing scientist, however you want to define that. He wasn't running studies. He wasn't doing randomized control trials. He wasn't necessarily collecting data, publishing that data. He wasn't doing statistics. The data Ellis was collecting was more on the anecdotal side. Would report what he found, would report what was happening, but he wasn't necessarily presenting data. Now, that really starts to help cognitive therapy, I think, to be more prominent within that CBT family, because one of the things that Beck did do was take a more research approach to the development of that therapy. So they start in these two different places. I think that's partly why REBT sometimes can get overlooked, it's because it didn't start in the way that we would later really, really value. We would value statistics, we'd value data, and rightly so. REBT has had to catch up to that in more recent times, probably in the last 30 years, where maybe CT's had maybe 50 to 60 years.
Yeah, of kind of empirical research behind it. It's kind of surprising because, like we've discussed previously about like Ellis really adopted like a Popperian approach. Like he was kind of particularly interested in like falsification and sort of criticality of his work, and was constantly, relatively consistently, like trying to do that and trying to question it, which is really kind of embedded within the scientific approach. And yet there was a lack of kind of empirical research around REBT.
Yeah, for sure. For a time, you start to get into the, obviously RBT comes about in the late 50s. You start to get into the 70s, you see more data start to emerge, the 80s, 90s. But I think in the past 20 to 25 years, there's been a lot of RBT research done that does start to give it that research side, that empirical side that it perhaps didn't necessarily have. It's not to say there were no studies of RBT before the sort of noughties and late 90s, but you do start to see mushroom around that time. And look, it's growing more and more now than I've ever seen it grow. So it's only going to be good, but it constantly feels like we're playing catch up. And for me, that's partly why it is often ignored, potentially through undergrad, through postgrad, because it hasn't got that big historical research base.
I guess like another question. Yeah, I guess like another question there would be, we've had another conversation we frequently have is about how everything is like a philosophical question, like when you sort of boil it down. And even like the scientific methods we approach, like kind of a philosophical question, like how do you want to approach answering this particular research question? And Ellis was like, sometimes when I hear Ellis speak, when I watch like YouTube clips or I read any of the literature that he wrote, I pick up different things at different points. So sometimes it might be the humour that sort of like really jumps out of REBT. Sometimes it might be kind of like the clinical aspect of it. But one sort of constant thread is it's almost like a philosophical standpoint or perspective as opposed to a scientific one. And I don't automatically want to assume that philosophy and sort of scientific approaches are mutually exclusive. But do you think that it may be because sort of people who are kind of maybe purists in terms of science see REBT as more of a philosophical standpoint, but philosophers see it too scientifically?
Maybe. I think that you mentioned earlier that Ellis was interested in falsification. I think there's when we're working with people, we're all working scientifically. REBT is a very scientific approach because we're looking at sometimes our internal states and we're questioning them, and we're usually doing that at a scientific basis. Where is the empirical evidence for what you believe? Is it logical? Is it consistent with reality? These are questions that are quite based in science, but REBT as a science is where it's playing catch up. Obviously, science has always been part of REBT in terms of how we question, how we see the world, and how we approach work. But it's the science of REBT that has probably not been at the forefront, which I think it is now, actually. I think there are lots of people, in fact, there's lots of people doing research in REBT that don't practice REBT. And that's always a good sign, I think. There's always downsides to that because you never want too much of a gap between the research and the applied side of things. But I always think that's a good sign that people are interested in this as a scientific endeavour as well as a kind of psychotherapeutic practice. But when you're working with REBT, I call it scientists in cahoots. You and the client. You are scientists together. You're trying to figure this thing out, these beliefs, trying to figure out the validity of these cognitions, beliefs, the way that somebody's thinking and behaving. Trying to figure out, is it consistent with reality? Are we best placed to be functional in difficult circumstances? These are scientific questions, so science is an important part of what we do. So it's hard to separate them, really. It's hard to separate that from REBT. As much as it's philosophical, and take your point there, but it's kind of the practice of REBT seems to me, when you look at it objectively, to be this scientific endeavour of figuring out what works and what's valid and what's logical. And it's a very scientific approach.
So I guess like that kind of really surmises like why maybe REBT has been overlooked to an extent, which I think we can agree it certainly has. But there might be sort of some other reasons, and another conversation that we frequently have, and I guess just to flag this up for the listeners or viewers now that Martin and I do pretty much exclusively just chat about this stuff. We live quite exciting lives, I think, Martin. I think is what people will take away
and
from
if
this.
Stu tries to talk to me about something else, I just shut him down immediately.
Which is why I had to bring.
I will only talk to Stu about RBT.
Yeah, almost exclusively. Which is fun. Yeah, which is good. So, okay. So one thing we've had like discussions about before is maybe these kind of like the straw manning or kind of the misrepresentation might be a more accurate term of REBT. Have you got a favourite? Have you got like this is the one that kind of really stands out?
My favourite one is so basic that REBT, rational emotive behaviour therapy, is too focused on rationality. It's a bit like, well, okay, fine. I don't know what people mean by too focused, but this is a criticism that's levelled at REBT that essentially what we're doing is trying to make people into rational beings. Now, human beings aren't rational.
Yeah.
We can't be described in that way. Obviously, we can't be described as completely irrational either. But there's plenty of examples of human beings behaving, thinking irrationally, and plenty of examples of us, being rational. It's not that we're trying to make people into these cold, rational, sort of robotic Spock type people. It's not rational in that sense. And I think using rational in the title of REBT has meant that the connotations are that it's more of a cold, calculating, robotic type rationality, when it's not really. The rationality is based around is what you think and believe based on evidence. Is it logical? Is it useful? These aren't. Yes, that's a form of rationality. You have a goal. You're trying to figure out how to best get to that goal. So it makes sense. It would be rational to think and behave and emote in ways that get you closer to that goal than further away from it. That's the rationality that's applied in RBT, not necessarily this kind of emotionless rationality. And part of that comes from, obviously RBT heavily borrows from Stoicism, and Stoicism is treated in the same way. Small s Stoicism, cold, emotionless reactions or approach to things. Again, that's not what big S Stoicism is about. And I feel like both of those areas, Stoicism and RBT, both suffer from the word that's at the front of those approaches has a different definition outside of those approaches. The dictionary definition of Stoicism isn't necessarily the same as big S philosophical school Stoicism, and the dictionary definition of rational isn't the same as the rationality and rational we would use within RBT. We have a technical definition. So I think that's one of the more frustrating ones for me is the idea that, rational, well, that must mean you have to be like Spock.
Do you think that's a responsibility, therefore, on like researchers to kind of clarify what is meant by this term rational? I've certainly come across like people when you talk about REBT or rationality, and they assume it's this lowercase s Stoicism, cold, logical, almost dehuman.
Well, yeah, for sure. You've got to communicate that. But there comes a point at which we have to be able to just say, well, this piece of work is about rational emotive behaviour therapy, and not have to lay out exactly what RBT is every time.
Sure.
We want to get to the point of the study, the point of the piece of work, and often you spend a lot of time explaining what RBT is and what rational means in that context, and having to just at length do that. Whereas you want to save space for writing about the methods and the results of what you've actually done. But I think it's an important piece of work to repeatedly do, you want somebody to pick up that piece of work and get an understanding, because it might be the first time they've ever come across REBT, and you want to head misconception and confusion off at the door, don't you? But it's very hard to do that in every piece of work.
So I guess, we've touched upon this kind of, it sort of dehumanizes people. This is something I kind of hear quite a lot. And I've had a few conversations about this, about how it dehumanizes people. So I've got like two questions for you. I'm going to split the questions up rather than asking both at the same time. So sort of to introduce the first one, I remember years ago, I was chatting to a bodybuilder, Martin. So a really big guy, like competitive bodybuilder. And just like, in like a quiet moment, like one time he said to me, this is the most pointless thing. Like I do the most pointless thing ever. And I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, I go to the gym. I lift loads of heavy stuff that's probably not good for me, like long term, might cause me like physical damage. He says like I eat a lot, which might not be doing my insides too great, or too much like help. And he goes, and I do it so I can get better at doing that rather than like a practical functional purpose. He says, and then I stand on a stage and I get people like to judge me on like how they think I've done compared to other people. He's like, and then to get to that point, like I'm tired because of the diet and the process you go through there. He goes, then I'll do it again. But he's like, but I want to do it. He goes, no, I don't really know why. Like I want to do it. So that's a nice way, I guess, of asking this question. Like, do humans need to be irrational in something? Like, do you think there's like this need in us to go, well, I need to kind of have this goal that doesn't necessarily make like logical sense that why I do it, and I might even know it's illogical, but I need to have a purpose. I need to do something.
Well, we're lucky that we have a civilization where even pursuits that you would say outside of the context that you do them in are, you could say that, okay, there's no point to them. But we're lucky enough that we have a system where the point becomes building resource. Does it feed you? Does it feed those within your care? Does it help you to build resource? And there's lots of jobs that you could say, okay, what is the functional purpose of that job other than earning money to help somebody sustain themselves? And maybe that's enough. We have this system in place where people can do all kinds of things to earn money and take care of themselves and others, and that's a really good thing. If we look too deeply at what is the purpose of each person's role and jobs, then I think things start to come a little bit unstuck. To me, if we go back to that definition I gave earlier of rationality, okay, you have a goal and you're striving towards that goal. You're trying to think and behave and emote in ways that get you closer to the goal. So if your goal is contentment in your life, and that means having a good home life, providing for people, providing for yourself, then it really doesn't matter what job you do in order to meet that goal. If it meets that goal, now you would want to avoid things that actively cause harm in others and maybe cause harm to the world. And we're dealing with some of the consequences of that in the modern age. The pure pursuit of money at the cost of everything else. I definitely wouldn't advocate for that. But in terms of finding a useful pursuit for yourself that gives you purpose and that can help you develop resource, I can only see that's quite a good thing. You know what I mean? And we don't want to question too much each individual's choice of job, because look at the job that we do. There are some things within our jobs that you could label as pretty pointless when you think about the bureaucratic side of what we do. When I'm working with people on a one-to-one basis or within a group, then I'm like, okay, well, there's some purpose here. Or producing some research that might have an impact or might change something. Okay, well, we're doing something here that might be purposeful. But when you think about the things you have to do in order to get to do that, you are running into things that you think, what is the point of this? This isn't helping me. It's not helping anyone. You have to jump through those hoops because you're involved in a system, and sometimes you have to do things even to get the opportunity to do the things that you want. It's just It's part of our bureaucratic system. As long as the end point is still virtuous, and still is designed to have some sort of impact and designed to develop some resource, then I think it's okay personally. Makes it's a bit of a ramble. Does that make a bit of sense?
Oh, I think my question was a bit of a ramble. It just kind of sprung to mind. And I guess the viewers need to know these aren't scripted. These are very kind of off the cuff chats that Martin and I have exclusively about REBT. So I guess like my second point to that would be about this like humanistic element to it. Is like one criticism of REBT is that it dehumanizes people because it assumes that we want to eliminate like kind of negative emotions. So, we're experiencing anxiety, depression, or unhealthy anger. Like we need to get rid of that. And this is the one. This is kind of like my bugbear one actually, because I actually find REBT is the opposite. I find it very humanistic because it doesn't seek to eliminate negative emotions. In fact, it's very clear that it distinguishes between unhealthy negative emotions and healthy negative emotions. So we shouldn't kind of necessarily have this like meta, like it's kind of like meta anger, if you like, about, oh, I feel angry and I shouldn't ever feel this negative emotion. And that makes me feel angry. It's like, well, it's human to feel angry about something. But REBT seeks to, in my opinion, and I'd love to know your opinion on this, Martin, is seeks to do two things. And the first is to modify it. So if you're feeling that it's unhealthy anger, so anger that doesn't suit your purpose, then it seeks to modify it to a healthy anger rather than eliminate anger itself. And I guess the second thing that it tries to do is have the individual like accept, like shit happens and you are going to feel angry sometimes. And not only is that normal, but it can be adaptive. It can be a good thing, but you just need to, utilize it in the right way. What are your thoughts?